True. I think we're
Hi,
live.
Charles. All right, awesome.
So what do we have for people today?
The current issue of the IEEE Potentials magazine. I, I
Interesting.
got I got it in the mail today.
Yeah.
Um, if you need to reach out, I'm Drew at IEEE.org.
Did you actually get Drew?
Oh yes, I
Just
did.
Drew?
I've sent you email from there, haven't I?
Okay. Okay. Cool. I guess
Yeah.
I wasn't paying attention. No, that's. I wasn't sure. Like there's I assume lots of Drews, so
Yeah,
I kind
one
of
would
assumed.
assume, but you know what the funny thing is, with some things, I assume that I assume that most people make that assumption, and so even the simple names are sometimes not taken.
I wonder if they have Charles still. Maybe I can get that.
Doubt it, but maybe
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You should try.
Yeah.
I don't I suspect that not that many not that many people have the IEEE email addresses.
Yeah. I think the IEEE was more popular maybe like 30 years ago or something like that. I don't know how popular it is anymore.
I think it's yeah, I think like the whole idea of like associations and sharing, publications and there there's there are definitely some benefits to it, but
Yeah.
um, I feel like it's much bigger of a thing in the UK.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
it just seems like almost all of the stuff is based around the UK. It could
Yeah.
be that it could not be not like actually I'm looking at the people like the that have written um, this magazine and they're not. But I was reading this article. Johnny still can't write. I thought it's pretty interesting. It talks about accreditation for
Yeah.
engineering,
Yeah.
and it talks about um, technical writing.
Yeah.
And I think it makes some interesting points, and but I wonder how relevant uh, it really is, and I think that the author does as well. And now the author has like uh, I think a PhD in industrial management, and a master's in undergrad in electrical engineering
Yeah.
from the 70s.
Yeah.
So he's been around quite a while, and he said he's also got like 25 years of experience as a program evaluator um, uh, for program accreditation.
Yeah.
And and I guess like there's an interesting thing in that um, um, a lot of engineers are coming out of school, and this is engineer broadly speaking, so not
Yeah. Not
not
software.
not
Not just
software specifically, but including software
yeah.
engineering. And he says a lot of these engineers are coming out of school, but they're not really able to um, they're not able to properly document things. They're not able to do technical writing. They're not able to write. They're not able to format things the way that one might in an industry standard form. And I think that then he goes into like some of the things which are like you know um, there may be a course description called technical writing, but they're typically not taught by the engineering departments or the mathematics departments. They're taught um, by the English department or maybe the business department.
Yeah.
And the professors of those courses may be quite familiar with like the grammatical structure, the page layout, format, things like that, but they may also not be qualified really um, to critique the technical accuracy.
Yeah.
And so he's like, is this should this what are the ways that they could go about this? And then another thing is that like something that he talks about is how the exams or the tests are typically multiple choice based,
Yeah.
which he said this robs, he used the word, the term, robs the student of an opportunity to practice because um, because there's no discussion about it. There's no sort of that one-on-one that you might have with someone. And then but then he also talks about how like it would be very impractical within the amount of time to be able to introduce um, the sort of standards for some of this writing across various disciplines. Anyway,
Yeah, that's a lot there that you just mentioned.
yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if we're going to disagree or agree. Like when I hear people talk about accreditation, all that stuff, it always sounds like a job security like type scam. Like, oh, we can restrict the number of people by like preventing, so many people get accreditation, and we can put in all this stuff that maybe nobody cares about. It's like, okay, well, what standards, right? Like, I mean, there's standards in the sense that everyone's doing it, right? And then there's like people create specifications and call them standards, and it always annoys me. Like when I hear people calling these standards, like it's not a standard, it's a specification, right? It's not a standard unless people start, like everyone starts using it. And then they like try to shove it down people's throats. It's like, what if nobody cares? I mean, like maybe they've got something. Like I didn't read the
Well,
article,
let's get some examples and let's see why
okay.
is it a standard versus a specification. Because I would think that something like a duplex outlet, where I have my whatever it is 110 volt plug to plug in, so 110 volt being a standard, I would imagine, right, in Canada, and I guess in America and some other places. And then the type of outlet also being a standard, I guess, but there would be specifications for what that standard is.
Okay, I'll give you an example of what I mean, right? In the past, manual transmission cars used to be like what
Called
most people
standard.
had.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now their automatic transmission is like what's common, right?
Right.
Manual transmission used to be called standard, is because it was like what everyone had. It was the common thing, right? Now that it's not standard anymore. The standard is automatic, right? But it's a standard because it's common, because like most people use this, most people experience this, most people have this, right? If you create a specification, right, like you describe something, that doesn't make it a standard.
Do people still say standard though when they mean?
So it could be a language thing. It could be that I don't know. That's a good question. I don't say that anymore. Like I do prefer manual transmission, but I don't call it standard anymore.
Me too.
My father's generation would have been standard. But like when I see or I hear the word standard, I think what's common, what are most people using? And if some Yahoo, like even if they have some kind of organization they're part of, and they create a specification like this is the standard, it's like, okay, that sounds like at best wishful thinking, but it's not a standard yet. Like unless people start using this, most people start using this, it's not standard. Like the voltage plugs that we have in the wall, it's standard because it's everywhere. It's the common thing, right? It's not a standard because someone like described it.
Right. So when you say it's a standard, all you mean is like it's
common somewhere.
It's common, somewhere. Maybe even the preferred method, or a preferred method.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything about preferred, but I mean, because you could have something that people hate, but just everyone's using. It's the standard because, I'm not going to name specific software. Let's say you had a blogging software and it was really common, everyone used it, right? And maybe there's things about it people don't like.
Medium.
But it's standard because like everyone's using it, everyone's used to it. If you make something for it, then it just works with most people's stuff, right? They might not like it. But like someone creating a specification and saying it's standard, it's just, okay, that's nonsense.
Right. So you might say then that JavaScript is a standard language for browsers to support.
Yep. I would say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that makes sense. But accreditation is a pretty interesting thing. But also, I think so is technical writing, and I think that the point being made for being able to write specifications properly, like a technical specification for some work, whether that's a bridge or like whatever like that an engineer might be working on, or software or whatever. I think it's an interesting skill that that maybe should be required by a graduate of an engineering discipline.
So I think it so ultimately what should happen, unless you've got someone with guns pointing at your head trying to change this, right? Like someone's going to hire you, right? Or you're going to start your own company.
Sure.
And like ultimately either the company or you creating it or the customers or someone, right? They're going to want certain things, right? And like you could say, for example, like you should know how to have this skill, but it's like, if nobody cares, if nobody pays for you, why should they have it? Right.
Right.
So, I mean, like if there are things, for example, you find that maybe different software developers, there's conventions they have between them, maybe teach it, but like it shouldn't be ossified. It shouldn't be forced to just do this.
Yeah.
It
Well,
should
okay.
be able that
I'll
people,
think of,
let me finish my point. Sorry.
sure.
It should be able that if people figure out a new way of doing it, or a better way, or just an alternate way, it should be okay for them to switch. Or if they don't want to, if they want to stop it, if they find this completely useless,
Yeah.
right? There should be a way to do that. Not like you must do this no matter what.
I was gonna say it would kind of be like imposing a rule on computer science, or some sort of programming designation in university, a software development centered course, so computer science, software engineering, whatever it happens to be, imposing an entry requirement, for example, or even a graduation requirement of being able to transcribe at least 60 words per minute.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, right? Like, is it even necessary? I mean, like, ultimately,
I know some very good, in my opinion, software developers who can't type very well and even use one finger. I think it's funny and I kind of think it's cute, but it certainly doesn't prevent them from being excellent software developers.
Yeah, I don't think these kind of top-down approaches are wise. I think sometimes when people want it, it's a matter of job security. Sometimes it's a status thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's this elite group, only I'm part of it, or I'm one of the few, or something like that. But I don't think it like generally helps people, like in general, and it doesn't help new people.
So if we were to come up with an accreditation system for learning software, for example, software development, it might not be something that we would care about.
I think there's some things, let's say related to, say, the government, or the laws or something like that require you to do accreditation. I don't think it should, right? But you live in a world where it does. So in that sense, you might have to care about it, right? I think one of the powerful things about like software development is that anyone can do it, right? I know people who dropped out of high school, taught themselves a program, and are really successful software developers. I think that's awesome, right? It also means something else. You also get like some very mediocre programmers, but so what? I mean, that stuff sorts itself out when people start hiring and seeing how productive people are, right? Like, let as many people who want to do it, who can do it. Don't block it, right? It'll sort itself out. And we've been doing this like in software for a long time.
There seems to be this trend that throughout history, people have tried to keep something good for themselves, and then it gets out, and then it becomes like a really powerful tool for the masses, and it's very interesting. And you could think of it as like things like publishing books, newspapers, whatever. Radio, I think, was a huge impact on people because it was the first time that you had this sort of voice instantaneous communication over great distances, and then television, and it was very difficult. And now we have it's so accessible, YouTube, Twitch, being able to stream, anybody can do it, right? And I think that's something that it seems like it's sort of a trend, and I wonder if that's the case with software. I think, yeah, it is interesting. Like, what about it? So if you look at something like law, like not anybody can just go and be a lawyer, and not any school could just go and add a law department, even an established university.
It's a good way to keep your salary high, like restrict the supply of people who can do it. I mean, like, think like doctors, right? You need to be bright to do it, but you don't have to be that smart, right? And some of them make a lot of money, not all of them. I mean, like Canada has a system that kind of like forces down the prices, although that has a cost too. But it's a good way to keep like your salary high is to restrict how many people can do it, right? And like, if you're doing it with the power of law, you're doing it with the power of a gun, basically, because it ultimately comes down to that. I don't prefer that. I think if you're one of the ones who like are lucky enough to get that special magic ticket or license, fantastic, right? If you're not, it sucks for you and everyone else in the world, right? And
then there's also like unnecessary, or there's also going to be, I think, in those cases, hurdles to jump over to get them that are maybe ridiculous, or
Yeah, yeah, but why? Like, I
Hmm.
mean, like it only benefits the people who have that magic license. It
Hmm.
like everyone else is harmed by it, right? It's not in most people's interest to do this, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But anyway, yeah. So with software, the barrier for entry is also the barrier for entry is basically whether you want to do it or not, right?
yeah, yeah. Like, I mean, like you could actually like just learn this stuff, start your own company, create a product, and have a successful like life and source of income off this.
And indeed, a lot of
Um,
people do. So
yeah,
there's actually something that's kind of interesting that people call self-learning, right?
yeah.
Or I taught myself this, or I taught myself that. People say things like that. What does that mean?
Autodidact,
Hmm.
autodidact. I think some people call it.
Yeah.
Um, so some people will. I mean, I guess in this age of the internet, although before it might have been like, they might have access to someone that knows this stuff and they can learn from them, or maybe they. What was common when I was younger was getting magazines. Like, I learned a lot of stuff about computers from magazines, or get it by a book. Eventually, the internet came out. There's plenty of articles. There's tons of stuff on YouTube. There's people you can watch on Twitch, and you could learn this stuff on your own. Um, I've been learning injection molding on my own, which is kind of interesting. Like there's all sorts of stuff you have to do within CAD software to make it so it works with this. But it's
Hmm.
like I didn't have to necessarily do it. Now you can, right? I'm not saying you have to go learn all this stuff on your
So
own, but like
so
some
a
people,
really interesting thing because I mean I see this fairly often. I'll see somebody
yeah,
have they have like a computer science degree in a few years experience programming and then they have on their LinkedIn self-taught programmer. And
yeah,
it's like, yeah, okay, but what do you mean by that? And I guess really what people mean by that is it's something they do for fun for themselves that they're going to spend time on outside of work. And it's
yeah,
like they'll continue to learn. So if for example, if I read a book, like I could say Richard Dawkins taught me biology because I read his books,
yeah,
right? Or I could say I taught myself by reading his books. And I think a big part of it also is maybe um, if you go and take a course, if you go and get guided by other people, they've charted out a course for you, and you can follow that path. So
yeah,
you don't have to do the research around what it is you don't know and
yeah,
how to get there. And hopefully they've done a good job or a reasonably good enough job that you'll be able to get where you want without having the benefit of hindsight when you're first starting out.
yeah,
Um, and I think that's something that oftentimes um, if and I wonder if this is actually quite important or not, but oftentimes when you're first starting out with something, if um, you have to find all of the things, right? You want to learn something, so you look not just deeply at one thing but maybe broadly at some things and then deep at some of them as well, and then you get a better sense of where you want to go further and so on and so forth. And then if you're setting things up for somebody else to learn, you might want to remove some of those barriers that you faced at first or some of the difficulties that you faced at first because you were still searching, so you just guide them directly down this one path. is
yeah.
there is that beneficial overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it can be useful to learn with others, right? Like, and if someone has a lot more experience than you, they can sometimes point you in the direction, right? Like,
Hmm.
you a lot of the stuff you can learn on your own just by kind of fumbling around, but could you do it quicker, right? Could you
Well,
do it?
well, well. There's this thing. Like a lot of the stuff you could just learn on your own by fumbling around. Like it took hundreds or thousands of years of people fumbling around to come up with computers and programming, right?
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. I mean, like some of it you
And
could. I mean,
coordinating that, so doing much more than just fumbling around, I would say. But I would be it would be pretty interesting if somebody could just fumble around and figure out how to do this stuff.
yeah. I mean, I think there's. I mean, like even when you're self-taught in a way, I mean, like reading books, watching YouTube videos,
Hmm.
reading articles, I think you're still in some senses learning from someone else. It's just
Hmm.
not, face to face, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
they created something that might outlast them. I mean, they might pass away, and
Hmm.
like that article still exists, that book still exists, that video still exists, and you can learn from them. And like, I
Well,
mean, like
that's sort of one of the greatest things about being able to share knowledge with each other, with all of the different ways that we have now. Maybe in the future we'll have I mean, I could almost, I would almost guarantee that in the future, if I could make such a guarantee, that we will have better ways, right? Because I mean, historically, we continue to get better and better ways of sharing information. Um, it's amazing. So, but it can also be overwhelming. And so we sort of decided, like, okay, let's carve a path to get familiar with enough things and to be able to get up and running with software development, for example. And we kind of thought that one of those things would be what we want to talk about today, I
Yep.
suppose, which is um, an MVC framework. And so this brings up I think a couple of words that we use a lot in software, and they're also used. Well, MVC is not used much outside of software, I don't think, but framework sure is. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what those two things mean. But before so let's talk about framework first. So what is a framework, and is it the same meaning in the context of software and outside of software?
Um, okay, so I think in this sense, framework is, I mean, like sometimes when people talk about frameworks, they talk about some kind of structure that supports something else,
Yeah.
right? Like the framework of a building or whatnot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when people talk about frameworks in this sense, it's a structure that can help you write a program, right? So instead of like creating the structure yourself, which sometimes people want to do, but instead of creating yourself, here's a structure you can fit whatever you want to into this. So it gives you some guidance, it gives you crutches in a sense that kind of help you write a program in a certain way, right? And in this case, you're writing in the MVC style, and we'll go into like what that means.
Yeah.
But
But framework, like a structure, so kind of like a shape or like
yep.
sets of rules, a way of looking at things, a way of doing
You're going to
things.
do things in a specific way, right?
Yeah.
In this case, it's writing a program. You're going to write a program in a specific way,
And in the
right?
case of like, a business framework, for example, or the way that frameworks use. So there's a physical, maybe if you're actually framing a house, there's a framework, but then there's the abstract.
Yeah, I mean, I guess think of like, okay, so in this sense, a framework is it's a common way of doing it, right? Like, let's say, for example, like if you go to some neighborhoods, all the houses are exactly the same, pretty much, right?
Right.
So you might start with like this style that's the same, and maybe on the inside, like you change the paint, maybe you put maybe like the stove's in the same place, but maybe this table you can put in different parts of the kitchen. You get some freedom, but there's a structure there that doesn't change, right? And maybe the outside you might paint a different color, but the basic structure doesn't change, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's in this sense, the MVC framework is there's a certain structure there. You have a bit of freedom to implement whatever you want, but there's some structure that doesn't change.
Right.
Right.
Now MVC itself, Model View Controller, is it's a design pattern.
Yeah.
And design patterns are actually kind of interesting. We don't have to talk all about, all of the different design patterns and get way off track. We'll come back and just talk about MVC. But broadly speaking, what are design patterns?
Oh, it's a fancy name for. Okay, so sometimes when you're programming something, you'll notice that you kind of repeat something over and over again. Not just you, maybe a lot of people. Like they do something very, very similar. And that's a pattern, right? Like you're repeating something over and over again.
Yeah.
And some of these things that you repeat over and over again when you write software, you call design patterns, right? Mm-hmm. Like for example, let's say that you're writing software and you need to connect to a printer, right? Mm-hmm. So you might say, okay, I need to connect to this printer, and there's only one printer, so I only need to connect to it once. Or like it could be a database, it could be a payment gateway to like get money from the customer. Mm-hmm. And I only want to have one connection to it, right? And there's a certain way you're going to do that, right? Like maybe you're using a language that, you want to return it from a function. And then what you do is you create it once, you put in a variable, and whenever that function returns, that thing, it might just go to that variable and give you that. So it always returns the exact same object in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like that handle, that grip, that connection you have to the printer or the database or the payment gateway or whatever, right? And you might say, okay, well, I see a bunch of people doing this. They do it for printers, they do it for payment gateways, they do it for anything else. Mm-hmm. We're going to give that a name. We're going to call that the singleton pattern, right? And like people code it a little differently depending on the language, depending on the environment, depending on whether you want different technical details in there, like making it reentrant or something like that. But we're just giving it a name, right? And of course, the people who name it are not the first person to create it. Tons of people did it before them, and that's the thing about, like, you'll find some books on these, like, those are not the people who created this. Tons of people did it themselves, and not just that.
Well,
like,
it's also like, it's not like the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, made the words.
yeah, I just want to point that out because I
Yeah.
think some people have the impression that the people who wrote those design pattern books somehow came up with those.
So there
And
was I don't know all of their names, but the Gang of Four,
yeah,
they did. I'm not sure how long they spent on it, but they looked at a bunch of enterprise code across a lot of large industry companies
yeah,
at the time, and they found commonality among
yeah,
that other people's code, and they saw like, oh, what's similar here, what's similar here, what's similar here, oh, look at all these things that are, there's these similar patterns, let's give them some names.
yeah.
And that was it's a very often talked about book, but it doesn't feel like a good starting point for a software developer. It's
Well,
something that,
it's a horrible book to learn from. Like, I mean,
yeah,
if you're already familiar with these and you go read the books, like, oh, okay, people
yeah.
call it this, or like at least the authors of this book call this. I don't know if anyone else does, but
Well,
like,
I think that's actually an important thing there, because once you now sort of name put a name to these things that we're calling patterns,
yeah,
now you have a single handle, like that variable that you can pass around. You have a single thing that um, you can reference, and
yeah,
other people will either know that or not, and then you can
yeah,
either explain it or not, right?
yeah. But it's the
Um,
creation of jargon, like stuff that like
it is, but it's
outsiders or
also, I mean, but that's how words work anyway.
yeah, yeah,
Right,
yeah,
but you're right, it does add to jargon. So anyway, so today's jargon is MVC, the
yeah,
model view controller.
yeah,
um, but that's what we're talking about. So model view controller, it's a pattern, it's something that a lot of people have done. It's also, it's something that we'll see, I think the first time that I heard like MVC framework, um, I didn't really have an idea of, like, if somebody said, "Oh, I just created my own MVC," um,
yeah,
and and I didn't really have an idea of how that would exist as a pattern outside of somebody else's framework at first. So it seemed like kind of a mystery, because unfortunately I'd heard the term before I'd actually had experience with building one.
yeah.
Um, Although I'd actually kind of had, well,
It's also
yeah,
like, there's nothing.
yeah, kind of had,
Why even use it? Right? Like,
yeah,
why use MVC? Like, it's not because like, oh, all the cool kids are using MVC. Like, that's an
no,
idiotic reason to use it,
yeah.
just because other
Well,
people are doing it.
what I think, and I think as we start to set this up, we'll start to see that it's somewhat of a it is a naturally evolving pattern from a lot of web development, especially if when you get into the idea of you have some sort of program that a user has a view into.
Yeah,
You have and then on the back end has a connection to or a need to grab data from some sort of data store, and
yeah,
then in between you have to sort of control the flow of data, right?
yeah.
And so,
I think MVCs, they were, I think they first, people noticed them on when people were creating GUI applications on desktops.
mhm.
So I think like back then they had it. Like, they
Oh
became
yeah,
popular on the web too. Like, I remember like doing this in like the late '90s for web stuff.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I mean, like part of the reason, like, I mean, you don't use it just to use it. You use it, like, there's a reason you use this. You use this because, like, hopefully it makes your life easier,
hmm,
right? It makes your life easier, like having to maintain coding, for example. Like,
yeah,
okay, here's an example. Um, Sometimes at some companies, right,
hmm,
the person who writes the HTML and CSS is not a software developer, right?
hmm,
And if you somehow embedded that HTML and CSS within your backend like the code for your backend
Yep.
system, like whether it's written in like, you know, PHP or Ruby or Python or
Sure.
Java
Yeah.
or C Sharp or whatever,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
They're not gonna be able to change it. They're not gonna
Yeah.
understand it, right? They need,
I've actually worked with people in exactly that situation, and then I had to I made a decision that we would stop using Haml, for
yeah,
example, which was like, you know, HTML
yeah,
um,
that's YAML.
processed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Haml.
So you want to make it so that people who aren't software developers can change like what the look you're getting, like the view,
Yeah.
right? Like
Mhm.
in the case of a web application, it's going to be HTML, CSS code, right?
Yeah.
So you need a way that they can like first see the stuff working, right, without having to run the code, but also edit the stuff and use it without having to get in the back end code, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so there's your V, right? Separate like the HTML and CSS, the view, like the stuff the user sees,
Mhm.
from the rest of the code. That's the V parts of MVC. Like that's the whole. That's one of the reasons why you might do this. It's the reason usually
Mhm.
you'd want to do this.
Yeah, so I would say that like we were saying, like it's not let's take this pattern and apply it. It's actually rather let's build a web app, and let's see what the pieces are. Oh, well, these happen to be, you know, these happen to fit very nicely into, you know, on the one end you have, like you just described, the view, so the separation of things, but it's the part that somebody sees and maybe interacts with.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
and like there's a reason why it's done that way. Like if it's not making your life easier, like consider why you're even doing this,
right.
right?
Yeah. So in the case of, you know, maybe well, let's just say we have some sort of, maybe there's a list of fruit that I like, for example, right? Or a shopping list, or to-do list is a pretty common one, or whatever it
Yeah,
is, right? But just something
yeah,
simple. So I might actually, I might need a way to um, to input the items, and I might
yeah,
need a way to view the items,
yeah,
right, that I've input,
yeah.
and maybe like obviously edit and delete potentially, right? But so I might actually start with something like a form where I can put in
An
a
HTML
word,
form.
an HTML form in this
Yeah,
case, right? So, but yeah, a form where I could put an input of, you know, a fruit that I liked, and then yeah, and so we could represent that in HTML, and then our view would be in HTML.
yeah. Okay.
And then with that, if I submit the form, then that submission is going to go where is going to go into our application. So something is going to get sent to something that would be server side, right?
Yep.
And then when it gets there, then there has to be some decision, right? Oh, well, let's check this, and now what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? Well, oh, something's coming in. Maybe there's a check, like, is it the right format? Is it the right type of thing? Can we trust this? Where are we going to send this? But eventually there's maybe some decision. Oh, okay, take this word and let's send it down to the place we're storing it.
Yep.
And then so that'll get sent down there. And so where that decision happens, usually that's something that controls the flow of data.
Yep.
So it could be like a controller, right?
Yep. That's what you call the controller. It's just a name, right? So we
Yeah.
already kind of saw like why do we do the V part, the view part? We separate
Mm-hmm.
that out just because the person who might be changing that isn't a programmer, right? Okay, so why separate out the controller from the the model, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's say, for example, you have a user database, right? And you write a query in this one controller to do this one thing, maybe to like sign up, and you write like another query in another controller to like change their first name or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you notice there's a bug in one of these, and you go and you fix it in one controller. Oh, but you forgot to fix the other one. So you go there, and then you go back and forth. Then you change the structure of the table and have to go into one control in another. And then you find like, man, I'm like duplicated. Like I have code in all these places that deals with the user table, and I have a bug in one, and I fix in one place, but I don't fix in all the other ones, right? And it's just getting like a tedious to deal with this and track down all the places I'm using the user table. So what happens if I consolidate that code to access the user database, right? And then I make it so that if I fix a bug one place, it's fixed everywhere. If I change the structure in one place, I don't have to like go in everywhere, change like have to remember to change the code, right? Because SQL is a string, right? If I change in one place, if I change the structure of the table, it doesn't break the code. It's not a compile error. But if I have a class or a struct, like depending on the language, and has methods, and if I change some of the methods in this, and in one of the controllers, like I didn't update it, it's a compile error. I notice there's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And it's easier to notice these kind of problems. That's part of why you would separate the M also, right?
Sure. I mean, I think so. I think there's the assumption there that you're using SQL, which we probably will at some point, but
yeah.
Well,
Well, I mean,
I think actually, even if you think about it, like let's assume in this case, like let's just go with a very trivial example where you'd have like the case that I said, you have a form on your view, and it's like an HTML.
Yeah.
So you submit that data. It comes. It's a single word, right? Like what's my favorite fruit or something. So like banana, whatever it is. That comes into your server-side code, and now it's like banana. Okay, I gotta write this. Well, the controller here that's dealing with like getting this word, it might not know, it might not care where anything gets written, right? It just knows, oh, here's this thing, I need to send it to save, right? Go save this. And then so when it says, save this, it has to pass it somewhere. Well, save this what? And then so you might have some function that you're going to have to write as well. And maybe it's inside this controller function, but for the reasons you just said, probably not. So then we have this idea that what we're storing here, banana, this fits into a model. It's a thing. It's a model. So it's like a banana thing. And so my banana might have some. So I said, oh, or fruit. Sorry, it's a fruit.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got this fruit. So now I've got like fruit. Save this fruit. And then so I need to send that somewhere that has the understanding of where and how it's saving, and whether it's saving it to a database, or whether it's saving it to a file, or whether it's saving it to memory, or whatever, or maybe an in-memory database. It doesn't matter, right? So it's just passing it down that one step. So basically, your model is at the layer where you're working. You'll write your functions, you'll write your interactions with the data, potentially.
Yeah. I mean, it's your data store. A lot of people use relational databases. They might use Postgres or MySQL or something. You don't have to. I mean,
it would be this. You could still find this sort of like a separation of the logic, regardless of whether you're using like a key value store database or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you could use Mongo. You could also do event sourcing. I've done it with that too. You would actually, like, even with event sourcing, you can structure in a way that kind of feels like a relational database too. Although I don't, it's not necessarily the best way to do it. Like with event sourcing, you would probably have commands in there, like, create user, add item to carts, or whatever. It's probably, I mean, you can also do that with even if you're using a relational database, you can have your low level type stuff that access the database, and sometimes people expose that to controller, or sometimes you put something a little higher level on it, or you kind of like specify intents, like add item to carts, rather than something that's more close to kind of like the way the table is actually structured. It just depends what you're going for.
Yeah. So coming back to the idea of like the, your view layer, you've got your controller that sort of goes between the views and then the data, and then you've got your model layer, which is sort of the data layer, right? So that's sort of the idea that we have, and this is what we're going to set up over the next few days to start writing some of that out. Where are we going to start with this?
Okay, so
like maybe we could actually just look at that model there, where it's that's the premise. We're going to have a list of fruit.
Yeah, so we're gonna code this out.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming we're gonna code out an MVC from scratch. And we're gonna show.
Well, when we say we're going to code out an MVC from scratch, what do we mean? Are we going to code out an application that follows or that exemplifies the pattern, an MVC pattern, or are we going to build a framework?
Yes. So both. So we're gonna create an application
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And when we first do it, like it's not going to use MVC, and we're going to show the pain we feel,
Hmm.
like when we code it without that, right? So we're going to create an application.
Oh
It's
yeah,
just going to hit this code,
that's
and
a
then
good
it's like,
idea.
we're doing this way where it's like we have the view kind of, it's not separated out, right?
Right,
And
right,
we'll
right.
see, okay, like when you code it this way, that the HTML or whatever is embedded into like all the program code, it's really hard to work with. It's really hard to
Yeah.
change anything. So let's separate that out, and that's the V, separated out. And
Hmm.
then like, when we deal with the data, it's like it also will help us to separate that out too. And we'll kind of like see exactly what that means, exactly how to do that, how an MVC actually works, but also why the hell are you doing it, right?
Yeah,
Like, I mean, you shouldn't just do it to do. I mean, sorry, there's sirens going by.
it's okay.
Um,
We can also talk a little bit about scope creep, because now feels like a good time for some scope creep. If we look at um, an MVC framework,
yeah,
then oftentimes there's a whole lot more than just the MVC that start to become interesting. So there's the idea of um, whether like are you serving uh, are you using HTTPS, for example? How are you doing your routing? Is that handled by the controller? Is it part of the controller? Is it a separate thing?
yeah,
What
I would,
about and
I
then
say that evolves into the controller,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because like you would probably, I mean, you could have one controller that handles every request. They
yeah,
might say, okay, well, I don't find that useful, right? Like at some level, I want to create separate methods or function for each endpoint. Like maybe I have an API, or if you do it like the more classical way, this is where you can see MVC, you just dump HTML. So it's not an API, it's not dumping JSON, it's just dumping web pages. So
mhm,
maybe you have a contact page, you have a product page, or something like that. And they might say, well, I don't want to put like putting everything in the same function is too messy. I need to have separate ones. And
mhm,
then you like the code that maps between, okay, it looks at the URL coming in. Like if it's slash, contact, I go to this method. If it's slash um, item slash, 123 or something, I
mhm,
go to this method. If it's, like any other URL, I might go to a different method, right?
yeah,
So like right there, you're creating a router, right? You're creating, like in this
mhm,
sense, it's a router from path of the
mhm,
URL to a method or a function, right?
mhm,
And it could be on different stuff. You can also route based on the HTTP method, right? Like if it's a get, if it's a post, it's a scream, a punch, a kick,
yeah, yeah,
I can go to another method or function, right? So this thing that handles that is the router. And then like, like if you're doing that, then in this sense, the controller is what it routes to, right?
mhm.
But of course, like you might not do that routing, and the controller might just be like
Handling
the
that, right?
handling everything, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But it's kind of for you, right? Like the reason you would separate that out because it makes your life easier, right?
mhm,
Like you're programming this. Like, do you find it easy to put everything in this giant like function or method? Like, no, okay, I want to separate this out, right?
yeah,
Okay, so it makes your life easier. And people gave that a name when you kind of like you get a route or you get a path and you send it to a method or function. You get a method, HTTP method, sent it to a method or function. Like we call that a router.
mhm.
Um, yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like we have a pretty good idea of what we can do, and I guess what we'll do is we'll start off tomorrow by building out that application as a big mess.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think it helps to kind of, I think a lot of people, like, if they just start learning a program, like, they'll do it
Mhm.
this other way first. And it's,
Oh
they're
yeah,
suffering that
I, I
they change the other way.
yeah, I think that getting an idea of what's there, and that's actually something that's interesting. Like, um, if you already have an idea of what your app's going to do, then you might start out, going down that route in your mind, and then separating things out and whatever from the beginning. But um, but maybe not as well. Like if I'm working on something completely from the ground up, I might I might build it out like that messy way first because I don't know where it's going yet.
Yeah, I did. I mean,
Yeah.
like some stuff now that I've been doing this for 25 years or so,
Mhm.
I tend just through experience. I was like, well, this is a new project, but I
Mhm.
kind of suspect we're going to have these things happen. And it's just
Yeah.
based on experience. And sometimes I'll do what I call future proofing, right?
Hmm.
Given that I think it's likely I'll have to go through this, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I'm going to prepare myself
Yeah.
just in case that happens, right?
And that's an interesting set of trade-offs to eh, to regulate.
Yeah.
Right? Like, is it responsible to make assumptions of the future at that point that you don't yet know? Is it responsible not to?
Yeah.
And there's trade-offs to each, right? Like
Yeah.
it can take time, you're putting some effort versus it didn't take that much time, it didn't take that much effort, and you could have
Yeah.
saved yourself from all
Yeah.
that future
I
stuff.
mean, part of it is it's a trade-off with my future self.
Hmm.
I'm putting in extra effort now, right? And it's obviously not ultimate effort. Like I make just a judgment. Like, okay, this isn't going to take me 3 months to put in this extra effort. It'll maybe take me like a few hours or like a day or something like that,
Hmm.
right? And I might be wrong, but if I'm correct, 8 months from now, it'll be way easier. It'll save me months, like 8 months from now,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know, like I could be wrong, but like the cost, I judge personally, I make the judgment that the cost is worth it because it's not that long now. It's like a day or it's like a few hours or something like that.
Yeah. And that sort of judgment would be something like whether to use an ORM or not,
Yeah.
for example. Could
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. I tend to write, I mean, it depends what you mean by ORM, but I tend to write my access to the database directly.
Hmm.
I tend not to like generated ORMs for a reason. I find it, at least in the past, and like this has kind of soured me to like future ones. But at least in the past, I found it really difficult to use them, right? Like, let's say, for example, like some of the ORMs I used in the past, if you wanted a query of a single table, it was really easy to do. Let's say I needed to join 2 or 3 tables. Nope, sorry, not supported, right? And it's like, well, how do I do this? Well, you can't. It's like, okay, this is screwed up. So
Yeah.
can I write from scratch? No, you can't, because guess what? Into some of these ORMs, we threw extra code that does not exist in the database. So you have to go through this ORM no matter what. It's like, okay, this is retarded, right? And it made my life more painful, right? So
Mhm.
I often don't use them because people put what you might call business logic. They put some processing that must be done within the ORM rather than in the database somehow. And it makes it so that I can't use the database directly anymore. The database is no longer an API to the data. The ORM is, right? But your ORM doesn't support what I consider basic operations like table joins, right? So I've now gone the approach where I'll just kind of roll my own, right? I will create structs or classes, whatever we're going to call them, and I will write SQL within them. But they'll like I won't use the SQL directly from the controllers. I will create methods and I'll use those. And sometimes these ones have common patterns, and I might even like do code generation or whatever, depending on the language. Maybe if the language has like templates or whatever to make my life easier for someone using well-tested code.
Mhm.
But also like it allows me to extend it and make like bespoke, like custom things specific towards that problem. But it means that I don't get kind of like sucked into a trap if I have an ORM that doesn't do all the what I consider basic things like a table join, for example. And it makes it so that just as discipline to myself, I don't put logic that's absolutely essential within this thing, like this class or struct, like it should go in the database. Like, I mean, it's a very common thing, like in my experience, right? That you'll get people who are non-technical, like non-software developers at the company. They'll want to access the database for different reasons. Like they could ask you, you could build something, but they're not. They're just going to use this tool because it's a lot quicker and you're busy doing other stuff.
Yep.
So they get some tool, they use some kind of protocol to access the database, and they start getting all these charts and graphs and all this other stuff. And if you put a bunch of essential stuff within this like class or struct within your code, it doesn't actually work properly, right? And like they can't even do that. And it's like you've created all this, you've created problems, and you might not realize you're creating these problems, right? But like you created a problem and you might not want to have solve it or try to solve it. It makes all sorts of other issues, right?
Yeah, and then there's and then 8 months from now, you've got all of this stuff and so many things that are relying on things working, and you can't make changes easily
No. And like, yeah, I
to
mean,
accommodate
switching,
it.
like, for example, like let's say you wanted to like create another backend in another language, right? Like, so you were working on one programming language, you want to switch to another. Oh, guess what? All that special logic is contained in the ORM in that programming language. Like, you can't even do that,
Hmm.
right? And I'm not saying like you have to use like multiple languages on the back end, but like if you wanted to, like, what if you bought another company and they're using something else, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, you can't even merge the things. So that's painful. Then like try getting out of that situation. Try digging yourself out of that hole. It's not fun.
Hmm.
It might have been easier to like not go that route.
Yeah. So that would be an interesting thing to build out.
Yeah, yeah. Build out an
But,
ORM.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
like building an MVC has you building each of these, right? And
yeah. Well, I think that's actually a really interesting thing because you could touch upon some of these things. You can dive as far into them as we want, and we could also look at maybe some of the trade-offs of just using somebody else's versus rolling your own. That sounds really fun. So I think that we'll have a lot of discussion and a lot of interesting things going forward. What would be like a good path to start with? And I think we'll be able to build out um, most of an app that just does, here's a form, um, and now we're writing our form to a file, for example. And um, yeah, I think we can do that probably within a day.
yeah, I think that you don't necessarily need the complexity of like having Postgres there, right? Because
No.
if I do all that Postgres stuff, that stuff might confuse people. But like writing the data to a file, for example, right? Like that
Yeah.
might
Well,
be
I think in the case of the application that we've described, I want to have a way to have a basically a list of the fruits that I like.
yeah,
That's it's pretty yeah, it doesn't need anything other than just I'd like it to persist. So yeah, maybe write to a file.
yeah. I mean, if we wanted to, we could eventually like add Postgres and all that
Well,
stuff, right?
I think we will, and I think we'll explore that like as we add complexity to our app,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
we'll then maybe think that like, well, I want to have my list, and you want to have your list,
yeah, yeah,
and then we also want to be able to see, whose lists have commonality.
yeah, yeah. I think if we do it one step at a time,
Yeah.
it'll make it like it's these little digestible steps, right? You're not
Hmm.
getting this giant app just kind of thrown at you, right? You see step by step, like
Yeah.
okay, like we write this app, we do just basic stuff, and you can understand it. It makes sense. And then hey, look at this problem we have. Let's now
Hmm.
change the code to deal with that problem, and like it makes sense. You're following along.
Yeah.
Why you separate out the view from the rest, it's straightforward, et cetera, et cetera.
That sounds fun.
Um, yeah, yeah, cool.
All right. So same time, same place, next day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess
That sounds like it.
we're finishing a bit earlier today.
Are we?
It seems like it. Oh, if we're finishing now, like how long's it been? Oh no, no,
Um,
it's been an hour. Okay, I guess we've been doing this for a bit.
yeah.
Okay, cool.
So tomorrow we'll start out. We will take a look at building an HTML, or we'll think a little bit about the views. Like, what do we want them to look like? So, do we
Yeah,
have separate views for adding an item and displaying an item? Do we have it in the same view? We'll think through that a little bit. Think maybe some of the trade-offs about that. We'll send that to a server-side language. I'm sure we'll be using Go, um, and so we'll look at Go. Um, we'll look at probably, I guess, serving the views using Go's templating for views.
I was not even going to use that. I was just going to like write our own from scratch.
Oh, okay. So then
Yeah,
we could just write our own from scratch,
yeah. I mean,
and
I
then
was thinking
just
like the only thing we'd use of Go's like built-in stuff is just the HTTP like library.
oh yeah,
So
yeah. Okay, yep.
we'll do the whole thing from scratch.
Sounds good. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
What about writing to the file?
I mean, that's straightforward. I mean, they have like a OS. I think it's OS slash file
So
library.
we'll use that library as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it gives you like basic stuff that's similar to the stuff you would get on like say POSIX, like
Yeah,
Unix type environments. Like you have an open function, you
yeah.
can close the file, you can write to it. So there's like basic operations. So we create the structure. I mean, I'd imagine we create a text file and we just put items to it, right?
Hmm.
I mean, we can actually we could if we wanted to. I don't know if we want to do as part of the MVC stuff. We can show a database created from scratch, like how database tables
Well,
actually work, how indexes work,
I
right?
think for the MVC, we'll focus on the key parts of the MVC as like
Yeah,
a series, and then we'll have like some places where we'll come back and we'll say, okay, let's do a deeper dive into a database or
yeah.
an ORM.
Yeah, it's like how does a join work? Like
Yeah.
it's been a while since I've done it. I think there's like 4 different techniques, and you use different ones in different situations. Like how do you actually join tables, right?
Yeah, and when data is stored, how is it actually stored? Is it
Yeah.
just writing to files? What does it look like?
Yeah. And
What?
why is it stored that way, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it's just, well, you pick one way, but sometimes there's specific reasons why you do it that way, right? Which is like, I think the thing that a lot of people don't know necessarily, right? If they, I mean, you come into this like, well, everyone's doing it this way, so I'll do it this way. It's like, but why are they doing it that way? I mean, maybe those people copied others too, but like sometimes there's a reason. Sometimes that reason no longer applies, and people are doing it when it's no longer useful. But sometimes, like, there's
I think an interesting
reason.
thing was that identity is something like that, right? Like if I go to a bank and I know I know that I have access to my um, my money, right?
Yeah.
I have my PIN and I have my card. Why do they need to know anything else about me or my identity?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is there's parts of the government, what we call regulators, that kind of force certain things. I'm not saying necessarily they should. I don't think necessarily all the things on the books are useful or helpful. But some of it's not necessarily the bank's fault. Although, like, even if it changed, I don't know if they change. I mean, they're kind of very bureaucratic and they're not quick to change. So you get stuff like that that's not useful that happens, right? Or like I mean, think like the way an application deals with your identity and the way a bank deals with your identity is very different, right? Or like, like some parts of the government, like you want to change your address within an app. Okay, you just update it. You want to change your address with the city, give us $80. It's like, what?
Is that what? Is that true?
Yeah, you gotta like pay them to change your address. Which is kind of interesting.
It is interesting. I noticed, I spent some time in Korea, that almost all of the government interaction stuff there was very painless and cheap.
And the vending machines, you talk about those things?
No, the interaction with government.
Oh yeah.
I didn't have vending machines, but like, for example, if I, as a foreigner, so I often had to go to the immigration center and update my cards, for example, or getting a driver's license. Here's an interesting example. 20 minutes in and out of the
quick.
and I walked out with my license in hand.
Yeah,
that was including them taking my picture.
Yeah, when I was in
lining up.
I don't remember what city it was in Korea. It wasn't Seoul. It was some smaller place, but like there was a government place I went to with some other people, and there was like a vending machine you go to. It's like, oh, you want what document you want? Okay, just go to that.
Oh, really?
And just print it.
Right? Yeah, that must be new. I mean, I've been back now since for almost 10 years. So
yeah. I mean, I've been going pretty regularly the last while, but yeah, it's interesting. Like I like Korea quite a bit. The pollution, which some people claim is like a chunk that's coming from China, like not so much, right? I mean, I thought it was fog the first time I saw it. I was like, holy crap, I couldn't believe how thick it was.
Right? The yellow dust. Yeah, apparently Japan and China have been kind of co-working on a solution to that, which is to, like, I think it'll still take another 10 years or so, but it's like a 20-year or 30-year project to build a big forest. To build a big forest, to grow a massive forest that will stop that from happening.
It was I was surprised. I thought it was fog. Like I was in where was I staying? I can't remember where I was. It was somewhere in Seoul, right? I was staying, and then I looked out the window. I was like, oh, it's foggy. It's like, that's not fog, right? And like you look at the air quality reports, red everywhere. Warning: do not go outside. It's like, okay, I got business meetings. I kind of need to like go somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Cool. We should probably end this, I guess.
Yep. Sounds good. So we'll talk tomorrow.
Okay. I'll see you later, Drew. And to everyone else, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.